You're fired right now." Richard Coleman's voice cut through the Grandview Estate dining hall like a blade dropped onto glass, instantly silencing the soft clink of silverware and the low hum of classical music drifting from hidden speakers. The chandelier light shimmered over polished marble as Marcus Blake stood frozen near the service corridor, still holding a tray he had been clearing only seconds before. Richard didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Every word carried the weight of absolute authority. Around him, guests exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if what they were witnessing was a misunderstanding or a decision already made long before this moment. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out at first, as if the air itself had thickened between him and the man who owned everything in this room. "Sir, I don't understand," Marcus finally said, his tone careful, almost pleading, but Richard had already turned slightly away as if the conversation had ended before it began. "There's nothing to understand," Richard replied flatly, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit, as though he were dismissing a minor inconvenience rather than a man who had worked in his home for nearly a year. At the far end of the hall, 10-year-old Lily Blake stood half-hidden behind the grand staircase railing, her small fingers gripping the carved wood so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply watched, her eyes tracking every shift in expression, every subtle change in tone, as if trying to memorize a truth no child should have to decode. Marcus took a hesitant step forward. "If I did something wrong, I can fix it," he said quietly, but the words seemed to dissolve before they reached Richard, who finally turned back with a gaze as calm and cold as still water in winter. "It's already been decided," Richard said, and that was when the room changed, not with noise, but with silence so complete it felt heavier than sound itself. A server paused mid-step, a guest lowered their glass halfway to the table, and somewhere in the background, the soft piano music seemed to fade into nothing. Lily's eyes shifted slightly, not toward her father, but toward the far corner of the room where a small black object was almost hidden behind a decorative vase. It was no larger than a coin, yet something about it made her focus sharpen instantly. She had noticed it earlier that afternoon when she was walking through the living room after school, a small blinking light that didn't belong to anything her mother or father owned. Now, under the dimming glow of evening light, it seemed more deliberate, more out of place. Richard stepped closer to Marcus, lowering his voice just enough that only those nearest could hear. "You've been careless," he said. Marcus blinked. "Careless with what, sir?" But Richard didn't answer directly. Instead, he glanced briefly toward the living room archway, toward the space where Lily was standing, though he didn't seem to notice her presence. "This house runs on trust," Richard continued, "and trust is not something I can afford to question." The words felt final, like a door closing somewhere deep within the structure of the estate. Marcus looked down for a moment, his shoulders tightening as if absorbing a weight he couldn't name. "I've never taken anything that wasn't mine," he said quietly, but his voice lacked the force to push back against the moment unfolding around him. Lily took a small step forward without thinking, her curiosity overpowering hesitation. The small device she had seen earlier now felt less like an object and more like a question waiting to be answered. She remembered how she had seen it blinking when no one else was in the room, how it had seemed to point not at the guests or the furniture, but toward the center of everything that happened in this house. "Daddy," she whispered under her breath, though the word didn't reach him. Richard was already turning slightly, preparing to leave the room as if the matter had been settled. Marcus stood still, his expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief, as though the ground beneath him had shifted without warning. But Lily was no longer looking at either of them. She was looking at the object in the corner again, and now she was certain it was not supposed to be there. The faint reflection of its lens caught the chandelier light, and for a moment, it seemed almost like it was watching them back. Something inside her tightened, not fear exactly, but the awareness that something small had just become something far larger than anyone in this room understood. Marcus Blake stood motionless for a moment longer than anyone in the room expected, as if waiting for the air itself to correct what had just been said, but nothing changed except the growing weight of silence pressing against the walls of the Grandview Estate dining hall. Richard Coleman had already turned his attention away, speaking briefly to a nearby staff manager with calm precision, as though Marcus were no longer part of the equation at all. The staff manager, a tall man named Daniel Brooks, nodded quickly and stepped forward with professional composure that did not quite hide the tension in his jaw. Marcus lowered his eyes, swallowing hard as two security personnel approached from the side corridor, their steps measured and respectful, but final in purpose. "Sir, please allow me to explain," Marcus said again, his voice steadying only slightly, but Daniel raised a hand gently, signaling that explanations were no longer part of the process. "We will make sure your belongings are returned," Daniel said in a low tone, careful not to draw attention from the guests still seated at the long table, though every guest was already watching. Lily moved one step closer down the staircase, her small shoes silent against the polished wood, her gaze locked now not on her father, but on the small, blinking object in the corner of the living room archway. It pulsed faintly, almost rhythmically, like a quiet heartbeat that did not belong to the house. Marcus noticed her movement, and his expression softened instantly, as if he wanted to call out to her, but the presence of security beside him restrained him from speaking further. "Daddy," Lily said again, louder this time, but her voice barely carried across the distance of the grand room, swallowed by the size of the estate and the authority of the moment. Richard finally turned his head slightly, acknowledging the general direction of her voice without fully focusing on her, his attention still divided between conversation and control of the situation unfolding around him. "Go upstairs, Lily," Richard said calmly, not unkindly, but with the expectation of obedience that had always defined his world. Lily hesitated, her eyes flickering again to the small device, its faint light now more noticeable as the room dimmed slightly with the evening transition. "There is something in the living room," she said carefully, choosing each word as if unsure whether she was allowed to interrupt, but Richard only exhaled slightly, signaling mild impatience rather than concern. Daniel Brooks stepped closer to Marcus, lowering his voice. "This is simply a matter of policy compliance," he said, but Marcus shook his head once, confused and increasingly unsettled. "I have been working here for nearly a year," Marcus said quietly. "I have never violated any rule." A few guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing the emotional fracture forming beneath the surface of what was supposed to be an ordinary evening gathering. Richard finally approached the edge of the dining area again, glancing briefly toward the living room, where Lily stood frozen halfway between the stairs and the hall. "We will review everything internally," Richard said, his tone controlled, as if placing the matter into a mental compartment already labeled and closed. Lily took another step forward despite the instruction to remain upstairs, her focus entirely locked on the small device, now partially reflecting the chandelier light. "It is recording," she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else. But the words carried just enough to make Daniel glance toward the corner for a fraction of a second before regaining composure. Richard followed her gaze briefly, but saw only decorative arrangements and shadows shaped by furniture and lighting, nothing that would suggest concern. "Lily, enough," Richard said more firmly now, though still without anger, and this time Marcus finally looked directly at her, his expression shifting into quiet concern. "Sweetheart, go upstairs," Marcus said gently, the kindness in his voice contrasting sharply with the cold procedural atmosphere surrounding him. Lily hesitated again, torn between obedience and what she believed she was seeing, her small hands curling slightly as she tried to find words strong enough to make adults understand. The blinking device continued its steady rhythm, unnoticed by most, dismissed by others, but undeniably present in the space between certainty and doubt. Richard turned back toward Daniel, speaking in a lower tone about resolving staffing transitions and maintaining order within the household structure, his focus returning to control and closure. Marcus was guided slowly toward the corridor, his footsteps measured but heavy with unanswered questions, while Lily remained still in the center of the vast room, her eyes never leaving the corner where the device continued to blink quietly, as if waiting for someone to finally acknowledge it was there. The corridor lights of the Grandview estate had dimmed slightly as evening settled deeper into the mansion, and the atmosphere inside the living room felt heavier now, not because anything had changed visibly, but because Lily Blake remained standing exactly where everyone had asked her not to be, her attention locked on the small blinking device that no adult had yet chosen to acknowledge. Marcus Blake had been escorted only as far as the hallway entrance, where he now stood under quiet supervision, his posture restrained, but his eyes constantly searching for his daughter, while Richard Coleman continued speaking with Daniel Brooks near the dining table, their conversation low, controlled, and focused on procedural matters that seemed to erase Marcus from the room piece by piece. Lily took a careful step closer to the archway, her breathing steady but deliberate, as if she was trying to match the rhythm of the blinking light itself. And for the first time, she noticed something subtle she had missed before, a thin wire running from the device toward the upper molding of the wall, almost invisible unless someone was looking for it. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not with fear, but with focus, the kind of quiet concentration that children sometimes have when they are certain adults are overlooking something important. She glanced briefly toward the dining area where Richard stood, but he was still engaged in conversation, his back partially turned, his attention divided between business and dismissal. Lily slowly raised her hand and followed the direction of the wire along the edge of the wall, noticing that it led toward a decorative shelf where a small black tablet rested among ornamental items that did not match its modern design. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward, her small fingers reaching for the tablet, and when she lifted it, the screen illuminated instantly, revealing a live feed interface that displayed multiple angles of the house. For a brief moment she froze, understanding that this was not an ordinary household device, and her heart began to beat faster not from fear, but from realization. Behind her, Daniel Brooks noticed her movement and began to turn, but Richard's voice called his attention back toward the dining table, continuing the discussion about staffing transitions and internal protocols. Lily carefully navigated the tablet screen, her eyes scanning the icons and timestamps, and without fully understanding every technical detail, she recognized one pattern clearly. The living room camera feed was active, recording, and had been active during the entire interaction that had just occurred. She tapped gently on one of the playback options, and the screen shifted, showing a delayed recording of the same room, the same moment when Marcus had been dismissed, but from a slightly different angle. Her breath caught softly as she watched herself standing near the staircase earlier, watching her father being escorted away, and then she saw something else that made her pause completely. A second figure, briefly visible in the reflection of a glass surface near the corner, someone who had not been acknowledged by anyone in the room. Lily tilted the tablet slightly, zooming in carefully, and the image sharpened just enough to show that the device she had first noticed was not simply a passive object, but part of a network of hidden monitoring points placed throughout the living area. She turned her head slightly toward Richard, who was still speaking with Daniel, and for the first time she understood that what she was holding was not just a screen, but evidence of observation that extended beyond what any of the guests had been told. "Daddy," she called softly again, but this time her voice carried a different tone, more urgent, though still controlled. Marcus looked up immediately from the hallway, noticing the tablet in her hands, his expression shifting from confusion to concern as he realized she had accessed something she was not supposed to see. Richard finally turned at the sound of her voice, his attention narrowing as he noticed the device in Lily's hands, and for the first time that evening, his composed expression shifted slightly. "Lily, put that down," he said calmly, though there was a new edge of caution beneath the words. But Lily did not move, her eyes still fixed on the screen where the recorded footage continued to loop, showing angles of the room that suggested everything had been observed continuously from unseen positions. Daniel Brooks stepped forward quickly now, his professionalism tightening as he recognized the implications of what she was holding, and he reached out carefully, not to take it forcefully, but to assess it. "Where did you find that?" Daniel asked in a low voice, but Lily did not answer immediately, because on the screen she had just seen a timestamp that matched the exact moment Marcus had been dismissed, and another detail that made her pause. The camera feed had not only recorded, it had transmitted externally. Richard moved closer now, his attention fully drawn for the first time not to policy or procedure, but to the device itself in Lily's small hands, and the room that had once felt controlled and orderly began to feel subtly uncertain as the presence of hidden observation could no longer be ignored. Marcus took a step forward from the hallway despite the escort beside him, his voice quiet but firm as he asked, "What is she seeing?" and Lily finally lifted her eyes from the screen to meet the adults around her, holding the tablet slightly higher, as if presenting something that had always been there, but never acknowledged. The blinking device. In the corner continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, but now it no longer felt invisible, because its purpose had begun to surface in a way that no one in the room could easily dismiss anymore. Richard Coleman stood still for a moment that felt longer than anyone in the room expected, his eyes now fixed on the tablet in Lily Blake's small hands as the glow from the screen reflected faintly across his composed expression. The dining hall, once filled with controlled conversation and quiet dismissal, had shifted into something more fragile, as if every guest was now aware that the balance of authority had subtly changed. Daniel Brooks stepped closer to Lily, his voice lowered but firm, asking her to hand over the device, yet she did not move immediately, her focus locked on the footage still playing on the screen. Marcus Blake, still standing near the hallway entrance under quiet supervision, took a step forward despite the subtle warning posture of the security staff, his attention entirely on his daughter and the tablet she held, as if it contained something he had never been allowed to see. "Lily, please give that to me," Daniel said again, extending his hand carefully, but Lily's grip tightened slightly, not in defiance, but in uncertainty, as if she was still processing what she had just witnessed. Richard finally turned fully toward the situation, his calm demeanor no longer completely intact, replaced with a measured focus that had shifted away from dismissal and toward assessment. "What exactly is on that recording?" Richard asked, his tone steady but no longer indifferent. And for the first time that evening, the room felt less like a controlled environment and more like a space waiting for explanation. Lily looked up briefly, her voice small but clear as she responded. "It shows everything that happened before Daddy was taken away." The words settled heavily across the room, and several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that the situation had moved beyond a simple staffing decision. Daniel Brooks glanced at Richard, awaiting instruction, but Richard did not respond immediately, his attention now fully locked on the tablet as Lily tilted it slightly to replay the footage. On the screen, the living room appeared from a fixed angle, revealing movements and presence that had not been acknowledged during the earlier moments of conversation, including subtle activity near the corner where the small device had been installed. Marcus took another step forward, his voice now more urgent. "That is not part of anything I was told about," he said, confusion and concern blending in his expression as he looked between Richard and the screen. Lily tapped the playback control again, and the footage shifted to an earlier timestamp, showing a clearer sequence of events from earlier that afternoon, including brief movements near the living room archway that suggested observation points placed deliberately within the house. Richard's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in concentration, as if recalculating his understanding of the environment he believed he controlled. Daniel leaned closer to the screen, his professional composure beginning to show strain as he recognized that the device was not a simple household monitor, but part of a structured recording system. "This appears to be connected to external transmission," Daniel said carefully, choosing his words with precision, while Marcus shook his head slightly in disbelief. "I have never seen this before," Marcus said again, his voice quieter now, as if trying to reconcile the reality in front of him with everything he believed about his role in the house. Lily's hands remained steady on the tablet, though her expression showed the weight of what she was realizing, that the recordings did not just capture moments, but decisions made without everyone's knowledge. Richard finally reached out, not to take the tablet immediately, but to bring it closer for a clearer view, his gaze locked on the footage as it showed overlapping angles that suggested multiple recording points throughout the living space. The room behind him remained silent, guests no longer speaking, their attention drawn entirely to the unfolding discovery. Daniel straightened slightly, speaking in a lower tone. "If this system has been active without authorization disclosure, it raises significant concerns regarding internal surveillance protocols," he said, and the word surveillance seemed to settle heavily in the air. Marcus looked toward Lily again, his voice softening as he asked, "Sweetheart, where exactly did you see this installed?" And Lily pointed subtly toward the corner where the small blinking device continued its steady rhythm, now no longer unnoticed by anyone in the room. Richard followed her gesture, and for the first time, He studied the corner not as part of the room's design, but as a potential point of origin for something he had not been informed about. The atmosphere in the Grandview estate shifted again, not through sound or movement, but through the collective realization that what had begun as a simple dismissal now carried implications far beyond the moment, as the quiet blinking light continued to pulse in the background like a question that no one had yet fully answered. The atmosphere inside the Grandview estate had shifted from quiet uncertainty into controlled urgency as Richard Coleman finally made a subtle decision that changed the direction of the entire evening. Without raising his voice, he signaled to Daniel Brooks to step closer, and within seconds the tone of the room shifted from passive observation to structured response. Daniel immediately understood the implication and turned slightly toward the hallway where additional staff waited, giving a brief hand gesture that initiated a private protocol few guests had ever witnessed inside the estate. Marcus Blake remained near the corridor entrance, still under light supervision, but now the security staff around him no longer appeared focused on removal. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for instruction from Richard himself. Lily Blake still held the tablet tightly, her eyes moving between the screen and the adults around her, as if she was afraid that looking away even for a second might cause what she had discovered to disappear or be ignored. Richard approached her slowly now, not with the dismissive energy from earlier, but with a measured calm that suggested reassessment rather than conclusion. "Lily," he said gently, lowering his voice so it would not carry across the room. "I need you to come with me for a moment." Lily hesitated, glancing at Marcus first, and Marcus nodded slightly, his expression soft but concerned, signaling that she should comply. Daniel Brooks stepped in beside them, carefully taking the tablet from Lily's hands, not forcefully, but with deliberate caution, as if handling something far more sensitive than a household device. "We are going to the study," Daniel said quietly to Richard, and Richard gave a single nod in response, his attention already shifting toward the next phase of understanding rather than confrontation. The guests remained seated, though none of them were eating or speaking now, their presence reduced to silent observation as staff began subtly guiding movement within the estate to clear the dining area. Marcus was gently escorted forward as well, not out of the house, but toward the same direction as Richard and Lily, a shift that he immediately noticed but did not fully understand. Lily walked beside Daniel, her steps small but steady, her gaze occasionally flicking back toward the living room where the blinking device remained visible from a distance, still pulsing faintly, as if continuing to record without interruption. As they moved through the long corridor lined with framed artwork and glass reflections, Richard finally spoke again, this time not as an instruction but as a request for clarity. "Has this system ever been disclosed in our internal documentation?" he asked Daniel, who glanced down at the tablet now in his possession, scrolling through interface details with increasing focus. "Not in any of the operational summaries I have reviewed," Daniel responded carefully, which suggests it may not be part of the authorized household infrastructure. Marcus, walking slightly behind them, looked up sharply at those words, his confusion deepening as he tried to reconcile his position within a home that suddenly felt unfamiliar. "I have worked in this house every day for months," Marcus said quietly. "I have never seen anything like that installed." Lily turned her head slightly toward Marcus at his voice, as if seeking reassurance, but she also noticed the tension in Richard's expression, which was no longer dismissive but fully engaged in evaluation. They entered a smaller corridor leading toward the private study, where lighting was dimmer and the environment felt more contained, separated from the openness of the dining hall. Daniel stopped briefly at a wall panel, pressing a discrete control that locked certain access points behind them, signaling a transition from public household space to private internal review. Richard stepped into the study first, followed by Lily, then Marcus, with Daniel bringing the tablet forward and placing it carefully on a central table where its screen illuminated the dim room. The interface displayed multiple active feeds and archived segments, each labeled with timestamps and angles that suggested continuous coverage of key areas within the estate. Lily pointed slightly at one of the thumbnails without speaking, indicating the exact moment she had first noticed the blinking device, and Daniel enlarged the feed, revealing a clearer view of the living room corner and the subtle positioning of the recording equipment. Richard leaned forward slightly, his expression now fully focused, as if every assumption he had made earlier that evening was being quietly reevaluated in real time. "I want a full technical review of this system," Richard said calmly, addressing Daniel directly. "And I want to know exactly how long it has been active." Daniel nodded immediately, already beginning to document details on a secondary device. Marcus stood a few feet away, still processing the fact that his dismissal earlier had occurred in a space that may have been monitored in ways no one had disclosed to him. Lily remained close to the table, watching the screen intently, her small presence steady but observant, as the reality of what she had discovered continued to unfold in silence around her. The study door remained closed behind them, and for the first time since the evening began, the estate outside felt distant, as if the world beyond this room had temporarily paused to wait for answers that were only beginning to surface. Inside the private study of the Grandview estate, the atmosphere had become noticeably more controlled, not calmer, but structured in a way that suggested decisions were now being made with precision rather than reaction. Richard Coleman stood near the center of the room, his attention fixed on the large monitor Daniel Brooks had connected to the tablet feed, where multiple camera angles of the estate were now displayed in synchronized playback. Lily Blake remained close to the table, her small hands resting lightly on the edge as she watched the footage with quiet intensity, no longer uncertain but deeply focused, as if she understood that what she had found carried weight far beyond a simple household misunderstanding. Marcus Blake stood a few feet behind her, still processing everything that had happened within the past hour, his dismissal, the discovery of the device, and now the realization that the environment he had trusted may have been observing him in ways he was never informed about. Daniel adjusted the playback timeline, carefully scrolling through recorded segments while speaking in a measured tone. "The system appears to have been active continuously for at least several weeks," he said, with encrypted transmission channels routed externally. Richard did not respond immediately, his eyes remaining on the footage as if searching for inconsistencies or missing context that could explain what he was seeing. Lily pointed softly at one of the screen segments, where the living room corner showed the exact blinking device she had noticed earlier, now clearly linked to multiple hidden angles within the estate. "That is where I saw it first," she said quietly, her voice steady but careful, as if confirming something she had already accepted internally. Marcus stepped closer, his expression tightening as he watched the playback of earlier moments from the evening, including the interaction that had led to his removal from service. "I never authorized anything like this," Marcus said again, more firmly now, and his voice carried a mixture of confusion and concern that no one in the room dismissed. Daniel nodded slightly without looking away from the data stream. "There is no record of authorization tied to household management," he confirmed, which suggests external installation or administrative override. Richard finally spoke, his tone calm but more deliberate than before. "Then we need to identify the source immediately," he said, shifting his focus from observation to action. Lily looked up at him briefly, sensing a change in the energy of the room, where uncertainty was now transitioning into investigation. Daniel opened a secondary interface, revealing network logs that showed intermittent signal transfers occurring during key moments earlier in the evening. "These transmissions coincide with every major interaction in the living room tonight," Daniel explained, carefully emphasizing the timing without drawing premature conclusions. Marcus listened in silence, his hands loosely clasped in front of him, as if trying to ground himself while everything he thought was stable became increasingly uncertain. Richard moved closer to the monitor, studying the pattern of recordings, his eyes narrowing slightly as he noticed a consistent focus on specific zones within the house, particularly areas where staff movement and guest interactions overlapped. "This was not passive monitoring," Richard said quietly, more to himself than anyone else. "This was structured observation." The words settled heavily in the room, changing the tone from confusion to seriousness. Lily shifted slightly, glancing between her father and Richard, sensing that the situation had moved beyond what she initially understood when she first found the device. Daniel continued scanning, then paused as a new entry appeared on the system log, indicating an external synchronization event that had occurred shortly before Richard's earlier decision in the dining hall. "There is a remote access confirmation," Daniel said, his voice lower now. But the source is masked through multiple layers of encryption. Richard exhaled slowly, his composure still intact, but clearly engaged in deeper analysis. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice softer. If this has been watching everything, then my dismissal. He paused, not finishing the sentence, as the implication settled between them. Lily placed her small hand gently on the edge of the table again, watching the footage replay the same living room angle where she had first seen the blinking light, now understanding that what she had noticed was not accidental but part of a larger system. Richard turned slightly toward her, his expression no longer distant, acknowledging for the first time that her observation had initiated a critical shift in understanding. "You did the right thing bringing this forward," he said calmly, and Lily nodded faintly without looking away from the screen. The room remained quiet except for the soft interface sounds of the system playback, as each of them continued to piece together a reality that was only now beginning to reveal its full complexity within the controlled silence of the study. The tension inside the Grandview Estate study had shifted again, no longer focused solely on discovery, but now leaning toward interpretation, as Richard Coleman stood with his arms loosely folded, watching the synchronized playback of multiple camera angles spread across the monitor in front of him. Daniel Brooks continued analyzing the system logs in real time, his fingers moving steadily as new lines of encrypted activity appeared, each one reinforcing the conclusion that the surveillance network had been operating with a level of structure that went far beyond household monitoring. Lily Blake remained seated near the table, her eyes fixed on the screen, no longer startled by what she saw, but instead quietly absorbing every detail, as if her understanding of the situation was growing in layers with each passing second. Marcus Blake stood slightly behind her, his posture still restrained, but his attention now fully locked onto the footage that replayed earlier moments of the evening, including the exact sequence that had led to his removal from service. Daniel spoke without looking up from the console. "There is a consistent external access pattern every time key interactions occur in the main living space," he said, which suggests real-time observation rather than passive recording. Richard nodded slightly, his gaze narrowing as he processed the implication, his voice calm, but increasingly deliberate. "So, someone was actively watching decisions as they were being made," he said, more as a confirmation than a question. Lily leaned forward slightly, pointing at a section of the playback where multiple angles overlapped in the living room, revealing the positioning of devices that had gone unnoticed during the evening. "That is when Daddy was told to leave," she said softly, her voice steady but carrying a sense of realization that connected the footage to lived experience. Marcus exhaled slowly, his expression tightening as he watched himself being escorted through the corridor earlier, a moment that now felt different knowing it may have been observed in real time by unknown parties. "I was not informed of any of this," Marcus said again, his tone quieter now, not defensive but uncertain, as if trying to reconcile his understanding of his role with what he was now seeing. Daniel shifted the interface, pulling up metadata that highlighted specific timestamps aligned with the estate's internal communication logs. "The system is not only recording," Daniel explained. "It is correlating activity with external synchronization points, which indicates structured data collection rather than incidental surveillance." Richard stepped closer to the screen, studying the pattern with increased focus, his expression now reflecting calculation rather than reaction. "This means the entire environment has been mapped," he said calmly, "not just observed." Lily looked up at him briefly, her small voice breaking the technical silence. "Then everything that happened tonight was being watched," she said, not as a question, but as a conclusion she was still learning to accept. The room fell quiet for a moment, the only sound coming from the subtle interface tones of the system as Daniel continued tracing the origin pathways of the encrypted signals. Marcus placed one hand lightly on the edge of the table, steadying himself as the implications settled more deeply. "If that is true," he said, "then my removal was not just a decision in the moment." Richard turned slightly toward him, acknowledging the statement without interruption, his focus still divided between analysis and awareness. "We do not have confirmation of intent yet," Richard said carefully. "Only evidence of observation and timing correlation." Daniel paused, then highlighted a new sequence that had just appeared in the logs, showing a brief external activation during the exact window when Lily had first noticed the blinking device in the living room. This aligns with user interface interaction from outside the estate network, Daniel added, his tone now more cautious. Lily shifted her gaze back to the screen, noticing how the playback showed her earlier movement toward the corner where the device had been hidden, and how that moment seemed to coincide with a subtle spike in system activity. It reacted when I saw it, she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else, as if realizing that her presence had been part of the recorded pattern. Richard's expression tightened slightly, not with alarm, but with focused attention, as he leaned closer to the monitor. That suggests adaptive monitoring, he said slowly, considering the possibility that the system responded to human detection. Marcus looked between Richard and Daniel, his voice now steadier but filled with concern. Who would need to monitor a household at that level? He asked, though no one answered immediately. Daniel continued scanning the network layers, revealing additional hidden endpoints that extended beyond the estate itself. The architecture is not isolated, he said. It connects to an external framework that we have not yet identified. The realization settled into the room like a quiet shift in gravity, changing the way each of them viewed the house around them. Lily remained still, watching the screen as the footage replayed once more, now understanding that what she had first thought was a simple blinking light was actually part of a system that extended far beyond the room she stood in, while Richard Coleman stood silently beside the monitor, already beginning to consider the next step in uncovering who had been watching and why. The atmosphere inside the private study of the Grandview estate had grown heavier in a different way, no longer defined by confusion or discovery alone, but by the growing realization that the surveillance system uncovered by Lily Blake was part of something far more structured and far more deliberate than anyone had initially assumed. Richard Coleman stood near the central monitor, his posture steady but his focus sharpened, as Daniel Brooks continued running deeper analysis through encrypted network layers that revealed additional hidden connections extending beyond the estate's internal systems. Lily remained seated close to the table, her small frame still, her eyes moving between the screen and the adults around her, as if she was quietly learning how decisions were made when they shifted from personal judgment into structured investigation. Marcus Blake stood slightly behind her, his expression no longer confused in the same way as before, but now shaped by the weight of understanding that every moment from earlier that evening had likely been observed and recorded from multiple unseen angles. Daniel paused briefly as another layer of data loaded onto the screen, revealing a broader mapping of signal activity that extended far beyond the physical boundaries of the house. There is continuous external synchronization across multiple endpoints, Daniel said carefully, which indicates this system is not localized to the estate at all. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied the expanded network visualization now displayed across the monitor. So this is part of a wider infrastructure, he said calmly, not as speculation, but as structured reasoning. Lily shifted slightly in her seat, pointing gently at a section of the display where overlapping feeds converged on the living room feed from earlier in the evening. That is where I saw the blinking light, she said softly, her voice steady but carrying the clarity of someone who now understood its significance more fully. Marcus exhaled slowly, his gaze fixed on the same section of the screen, where his own movement earlier in the evening had been captured from multiple angles that he had never been aware of. I was never told any of this existed in the house, Marcus said again, his voice quieter now, as if speaking less to the room and more to the reality he was trying to reconcile internally. Daniel adjusted the interface again, revealing metadata tags that showed repeated activation patterns aligned with key conversational moments from earlier in the dining hall. These triggers correspond to specific decision points, Daniel explained, which suggests the system is not only recording but selectively prioritizing events in real time. Richard turned slightly toward him, his expression still controlled, but now carrying a deeper level of analytical focus. That means someone was not just observing, Richard said slowly. They were actively following the sequence of interactions as they unfolded. The room remained silent for a brief moment, the only movement coming from the subtle shifting of light across the monitor as the system continued to display layered recordings. Lily looked down briefly at her hands, then back up at the screen, as if trying to understand the scale of what she had accidentally uncovered earlier that evening. So everything we said and did was part of it, she said quietly, not as fear, but as realization forming into understanding. Marcus stepped slightly closer to her, his voice gentle but firm. You did not do anything wrong, he said softly, as if grounding her in the middle of something that was growing increasingly complex. Richard glanced at Lily briefly before returning his attention to the monitor, where additional nodes of external connectivity were now appearing as Daniel expanded the search parameters. We need to isolate the origin of this network, Richard said, his tone shifting into decisive focus, and determine exactly who has access to this level of information. Daniel nodded, already inputting commands that traced signal pathways beyond the estate's firewall, revealing intermittent access points that did not match any known internal authorization structure. There are entry signatures here that bypass standard security protocols, Daniel added carefully, which indicates external control layers were implemented at installation. Lily leaned slightly forward again, watching as a portion of the playback showed her earlier movement through the living room, now synchronized with system activity logs that highlighted corresponding spikes in external communication. It reacted when I got close, she said softly, more to herself than to anyone else, recognizing a pattern that connected her presence to system behavior. Richard observed the same correlation, his expression tightening slightly as he considered the implications of adaptive response behavior within a household environment. Marcus finally spoke again, his voice measured but unsettled. If this system was installed without disclosure, then every interaction I had in this house may have been observed without my knowledge, he said, the realization settling more deeply as he spoke it aloud. Daniel paused, then turned slightly toward Richard. Based on current data, that is a likely conclusion, he said carefully. The room fell into another stretch of silence, this one more reflective than tense, as each of them absorbed the scope of what had been revealed through Lily's initial observation. Richard finally stepped back from the monitor, his attention shifting from analysis to decision-making, as the estate around them remained still, the unseen system continuing to exist in the background of everything they now understood. The private study of the Grandview estate remained dimly lit as the final layers of the investigation unfolded across the central monitor, with Daniel Brooks now focused entirely on tracing the origin point of the encrypted surveillance network that had been discovered throughout the house. Richard Coleman stood slightly apart from the table, his posture calm, but his attention fully engaged, as if every detail on the screen was now part of a larger pattern that demanded careful reconstruction rather than immediate reaction. Lily Blake remained seated close to the table, her small hands resting lightly on the edge, watching as the system continued to reveal connections between internal camera feeds and external access points that extended far beyond anything originally documented for the estate infrastructure. Marcus Blake stood beside her, no longer under the same sense of procedural separation as before, but instead within the center of a developing understanding that his dismissal earlier in the evening had taken place under conditions influenced by systems no one in the room had authorized or fully understood. Daniel paused as a new data cluster resolved on the screen, highlighting a primary access node located outside the estate network, routed through multiple encrypted layers before connecting back into the household system. I have identified the origin gateway, Daniel said carefully, his tone controlled but firm, and it is not registered under any internal household or corporate security division. Richard stepped forward slightly, narrowing his focus on the highlighted entry as it stabilized on the screen, showing a structured access point that indicated deliberate external control rather than incidental intrusion. So someone installed a fully independent monitoring structure inside the property, Richard said slowly, more as confirmation than question, his voice steady, but now carrying the weight of direct implication. Lily leaned forward just slightly, her gaze fixed on the same point, recognizing the same blinking patterns she had first noticed in the living room now reflected across a much larger system map. That means it was always meant to be there, she said quietly, her voice calm but reflective, as if connecting earlier moments to a broader truth she had not fully understood until now. Marcus shifted his stance slightly, his expression tightening as the realization settled more deeply. If this system has been active since I started working here, he said carefully, then every interaction I had in this house may have been recorded and observed without my knowledge. Daniel nodded once, continuing to examine the layered encryption structure. Based on current logs, this system has been operational for a minimum of 6 weeks with consistent activity spikes aligned with household occupancy patterns, he said, choosing his words with precision. Richard remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the network visualization as it continued to map out interactions that corresponded with earlier events from the evening, including the moment Marcus had been dismissed from service. This changes the context of every decision made tonight, Richard said finally, his tone calm but definitive, as if shifting from observation into resolution. Lily glanced up at him briefly, then back to the screen, where the playback interface now showed synchronized footage from multiple angles of the estate, including the living room corner where she had first discovered the blinking device. Daniel continued tracing the signal path, revealing a final verification layer that confirmed external administrative access had been maintained throughout the system's operation. The control permissions are routed through a third-party administrative shell, Daniel explained, which suggests this was installed by an external contractor with elevated access privileges. Richard's expression tightened slightly as he absorbed the implication. Then he turned toward Marcus for the first time with a clear shift in tone. "Marcus, your employment termination is no longer valid under these conditions," Richard said calmly, as the basis for that decision was influenced by incomplete information. Marcus blinked slightly, as if needing a moment to process the reversal of the situation, his voice quiet when he responded. "I did not understand what was happening," he said simply, not as defense, but as clarification of his position within the confusion of the evening. Lily exhaled softly, still watching the screen, where the system now displayed a full map of the estate with multiple hidden nodes highlighted in sequence, each one corresponding to areas she had walked through earlier without realizing their significance. Richard moved closer to the table again, his focus now fully on resolution rather than discovery. "We will shut down all external access immediately," he said to Daniel, "and secure every point of entry into this system." Daniel nodded, already initiating the containment protocol, as the network visualization began to retract and isolate individual nodes across the display. The room remained quiet except for the subtle sounds of system processing, while Lily continued to observe the screen, her presence steady but thoughtful, as if understanding that her small observation earlier in the evening had initiated a chain of events that was now being resolved at a structural level. Marcus placed a gentle hand on the back of the chair beside Lily, his expression softened as he looked at her. "You saw something no one else noticed," he said quietly, and Lily nodded slightly without taking her eyes off the monitor. Richard finally stepped back, his attention shifting from the technical display to the broader implications of what had been uncovered inside his own estate, recognizing that what began as a dismissal and a misunderstanding had transformed into the exposure of a hidden system that required immediate correction and accountability. The blinking light that had once gone unnoticed was now gone from the active display, replaced by a controlled shutdown sequence, leaving the room in a state of quiet resolution as the evening inside the Grandview estate reached a decisive turning point where clarity finally replaced uncertainty.